If you develop an understanding of these practices and these teachings, that understanding should be an understanding that you continue to cultivate, continue to look to catch new insights, look to catch deeper understandings of what this is all about. In these teachings and practices, the teachings are called the Dharma in the Eastern traditions. And really, all that word means is the truth, which means that there are understandings, and there are teachings, and there are conditioning, and there is information that is not the truth. It is the information that gets developed through thinking about things. And that information that gets developed through thinking about things is not the truth, because thinking is an interpretation of what's happening. It's an interpretation of what's happening based on your conditioning. That's why all of us have different thinking from one person to the next, because your thinking is a function of your history and your conditioning, your beliefs, who your parents were, what school you went to, what your values are, how things occur for you is a function of that conditioning and that thought activity. And that thought activity and that conditioning is not the truth. It's not the way things really are. But collectively, human beings have become dependent on the thinking activity and what is called knowledge based on the thinking activity and information based on the thinking activity, which means that it's removed from the truth. It's a processing of what comes in through the senses. And so what we think is not what's true. What we think is the interpretation of what's happening based on our conditioning, our past experience. And if you look at it that way, you can see that the thinking activity that human beings do habitually, consistently, constantly, is artificial. It's artificial. It's interesting that they talk about artificial intelligence as if the intelligence that human beings have isn't artificial. But it is artificial. It's artificial because it's not actually the way it is. It is a process, a mental process related to the way it is. Thinking is a distorted process. It's an impulsive process. It's a process that's mechanical. It happens by itself all the time. It's happening by itself all the time. And one of the things that becomes possible through the practice of meditation and these teachings is you can start to get insight into the nature of suffering. Start to get insight into the nature of suffering and have an understanding about the nature of suffering that allows you to begin to get free from it. And one fundamental understanding about suffering that can be very powerful and very useful if you practice it is to understand that what you consider to be the source of what's upsetting you, what you consider to be the source of your suffering, is a mistaken understanding of reality. So if you look at what I'm talking about and you take something that is an upset that you experience. If you take an upset that you experience, it could be anything. It could be an upset related to somebody in your family. It could be an upset related to your health. It could be an upset related to your money. It could be an upset related to anything. And the definition of an upset is an unfulfilled expectation or a thwarted intention. It's upsetting when the way I expect things to happen isn't the way they do happen. It's disturbing and it's upsetting. And we attribute the source of the upset to something outside of ourselves. Look for yourself at this. If you come up with something that has been upsetting to you, what the thought process says is that the source of that upset is out here. It's something out here, and part of what's out here, when I say out here, I mean the body too, because the body is out here. So if you look at the source of the upset, you will see that you attribute the upset, the source of the upset, to be out in the world. You know, on Sunday mornings, the class is in a room that's next to a room where people are doing a spin class, and the walls are, we're not in a bank vault, so you can hear the noise pretty easily, right? And so if you're an inexperienced meditator, that would be a distraction. Yeah, that'd be something that would be interfering with your practice of meditation, right? And your mind will say, the source of that interference, the source of that disturbance, the source of that upset is the noise in the room next door, right? Pretty obvious, isn't it? Anybody would say that. It's that noise. People have come to this class and said that. I can't meditate because of that, the noise in that room. It could be, we could use that as an example, but you could use anything as an example and it'll be the same thing. The source of it will be something outside of yourself that's causing the upset. Through the practice of meditation and the development of an understanding through the teaching, we come to recognize that that's not true. Everything that you consider to be the source of the upset is a mistaken attribution. If somebody in your family is annoying or your partner is annoying, you would consider the source of the upset with them. They're the source of the upset. You know, that's why we have divorce. Right? But in these teachings and practices, what we're coming to understand and practice is that's not true. And that's good news that it's not true, because if it was true, you're in trouble, because if the source of the upset is outside of you, if the source of the upset in the terms of the noise is coming from the next room, we can't do anything about that. It's outside of our control. There are a lot of things, if you watch the news, the source of the upset is the news. Well, the news is outside of your control, so you can't do anything about that. But what we have come to understand through these teachings and practices is the actual source of the upset is not that. The actual source of the upset is your mind. You know, if the noise in the room next door, if the sounds in the room next door disturb you or distract you, right? That's happening where? Not there, it's happening in your mind. And there's proof. The evidence for that is that if you have somebody who's an experienced meditator that's sitting here, right, where they have cultivated a way of practicing meditation, so they experience a state of awareness and a state of being. And when you're experiencing a state of awareness and a state of being as your true nature, as the natural state, the source of the upset is handled. Because if the source of the upset is your mind, and practicing meditation is moving your attention away from that activity, right? Then when your attention's away from that activity, your attention's away from the source of the upset, because the source of the upset is your mind. Whenever you're upset, you may have thoughts about the upset being caused by something, but the reality of it is that no matter what the circumstances are, the one thing that's always the same is the upsets are happening in your mind. Is that not so? It's happening in your mind. You know, you hear the sounds coming from the other room, and the thought that occurs in your mind is that's a distraction. Where's that happening? In your mind, right? And what's causing that thought, right? Your conditioning, right? You've been conditioned to experience yourself as a physical body and a separate self, right? And once you're a physical body and a separate self, then you have to deal with everything that's affecting you, right? That's the thought process. You have to deal with everything that's affecting you. But in these teachings and practices, you only have to deal with one thing, your mind. Right? So if you cultivate your ability to move your awareness out of that thinking activity and experience the awareness of the body sitting here breathing, you're free when you're in that state of being, you're free from upset because upset occurs in the mind and your attention is now moved away from that. Yeah, the way you can determine whether somebody's going to be traumatized, right, is what their conditioning is. You know, how they're interpreting what's happening is going to determine whether they're traumatized. We know, for example, that the people that came back from the wars in Afghanistan or Vietnam, right, that not all of them were traumatized, even though we consider war to be a traumatic event. But not all of them were traumatized, right? So the source of the trauma can't be the war, or everybody would have to be traumatized, right? So that's an example of the source of the upset is the mental state of the person and the way they're interpreting what's happening causes the trauma. And that's an important thing to understand here, because as a psychologist, it was a turning of the corner. It was a changing of my entire understanding when I realized that the self, the reality of what you are, has never been traumatized. It can't be traumatized. But if you train somebody in meditation, right, who has been suffering from trauma, right, as soon as they begin to experience the natural state, as soon as they begin to experience their true nature, there's no trauma. The awareness is untraumatized. It's never traumatized. There's no trauma. So meditation is an effective treatment for trauma, because if you can practice experiencing yourself as what you actually are, which is untraumatized, right? And you do that consistently over time, right? Eventually the material that is the trauma, right, will dissolve, right, through lack of use. Through lack of use, because if you recognize that it's a thought activity that's causing trauma, it's a mental state that's causing trauma, and because that's the case, whenever that activity, that mental activity is happening, right, you understand what's going on now, so you don't attend to it. You stop being involved with it. You don't log on to it. You don't try and stop it. You don't try and change it. You're just aware of what it is, and you know it's nothing but a mental state. You know, when I treat people that have panic disorders, you know, panic attacks, anxiety attacks, right? The treatment that I give for them is to train them to meditate, and then once they have a sense of how meditation works and they're experiencing their true nature to some extent, what I say is if a panic attack occurs, just notice it. That's the treatment. Just notice it. Don't get involved with it. Just see it, that it's happening, right? Just see that it's happening. You know, allow yourself to be aware of it with an understanding that whatever comes goes. That's true of everything. Impermanence is the law of the universe. Whatever comes goes, right? So if you can maintain a relaxed state, if you can recognize what's going on in the mind and not get involved with it, it'll pass. It'll dissolve.
So allow it to happen.
Of course. Allow everything.
Persists.
That's right. That's right. Stop resisting. Stop resisting the circumstances in your life, and the circumstances will stop bothering you. You know? Stop thinking of yourself as a separate physical body and a separate personality, so that you can end that understanding that is causing the suffering, because that understanding is a misunderstanding of reality. You know, I'm not naive. I understand that what I'm talking about involves practice, involves learning and deepening your understanding of these things. But the deeper your understanding of these things is, and the clearer you are about how things work, the more motivated you are to practice meditation, because you know there's a way out. If you know there's a way out of suffering, does anybody have to talk you into using it? You know what I mean? It's like a no-brainer. If you know there's a way out of suffering, but the thing about it is you have to go through the process of practicing meditation, and when you begin to do the practice of meditation, in the beginning, it doesn't look like anything is happening, and it doesn't look like it works. It looks like you're just putting up with sitting there and being still. You're putting up with the experience because your mind just keeps running, you know, and you don't seem to be able to stay out of trouble. You don't seem to be able to stay out of that process, right? In the beginning, But one of the things about the personality is lazy. The personality is intolerant. The personality is impatient. The personality wants everything now. It's got a baby mind. Personality's got a baby mind. You know how babies are? If they don't get what they want, they start crying. No, I want my... We don't do that as adults overtly. We do it inside. Yeah. So the personality is lazy, and the personality is intolerant, and the personality is not patient. And so through practicing meditation, you have to sit through all that. You have to be committed, based on your understanding of this and the fact that it does work. You have to be committed in such a way where you will sit through that and not allow that to stop your commitment and your practice. And if you do that over time, this is the thing that people have to understand who are new at the practice of meditation. If you do that over time, it will lessen, it will change. You will get to a place where the mind will be quiet. You will get to a place where the body is trained to understand. The body starts to recognize that meditation is happening. Right? And the mind starts to calm down. The mind starts to get quiet. Why? Because it has lost its ability to determine you. And therefore, it will give up trying to determine you, because whenever it attempts to control you or determine you, right, you're not playing that game anymore. And it's very important to understand, one of the mistakes that people make in the practice of meditation is they think the practice of meditation is about not thinking or controlling the mind control. That people think that that's the case. That's not the case. It's not about controlling anything, let alone control the mind. It's about seeing things as they are, and if you see that the mind goes off the rails, if you see that the mind is interpreting things in a way that is dysfunctional, stop being interested in that. Why would you continue to be interested in being crazy? It doesn't make any sense, right? But the way that the mind works is, again, it attributes your craziness to being caused by things other than your mind, other than your conditioning. You're making me crazy. The world's making me crazy. My wife is making me crazy. My children are making me crazy. My body's making me crazy. So you have to give that stuff up. You have to surrender to the truth and realize that crazy is equal to thinking. One of the things we do that doesn't work is we make attributions about the mind. We say the mind wants something. The mind doesn't have any consciousness. The mind's not alive. It can't want anything. It can't do anything. It's a program. We're saying that this program is alive. If you think that the mind wants something or the mind's doing something, you're relating to it as if it's got a life. It doesn't have a life. It's just a program playing. And it can't determine what plays. It's just all automatic. It's triggering. It's buttons getting pushed. It's replaying neural patterns, right? It's all mechanical, right? It's not alive. It can't see anything. It can't experience anything. All it can do is produce thoughts and stimulate emotions, right? So as you practice meditation and you understand this, right, the relationship with the mind becomes workable. You don't expect the mind to be able to produce happiness. You don't expect the mind to be able to be creative. You don't expect the mind to produce peace or satisfaction. It's unable to do that because it's a survival operation. It's not interested in peace, it's interested in surviving. And the good news is, if you begin to practice meditation and you move your attention away from that activity and begin to experience the natural state, the way you actually are, without the thought process, you start to notice that that natural state is happy. That natural state is peaceful. That natural state is satisfied. That's real. That's alive. Right? That natural state is creative. And that natural state has wisdom. It's in relationship to the universe as the universe. It's in relationship to life as life. There's no separation. If you think your body is separate, I know everybody, see, one of the main things that has to happen to get free is you have to stop relating to the body as if you are the body, as if you're in, there's a self in here somewhere. You have to understand that there's no evidence for that. That's not true, that's not real, and that's part of the problem. If you think your body is separate from the rest of the universe, right, deprive it of the relationship to the environment. If you think your body is separate from the universe, deprive it of the relationship to the environment, meaning don't let it have any oxygen. Don't let it have any food, and see how long the body's around. Obviously, if it requires being related to the environment in order to survive, it must be part of that environment. It must not be separate from that environment. And so the fact that your body appears to be separate from the environment is an appearance. It's an appearance. It's not true. And when you get over that mistake and you start to experience yourself as the environment without a self, happiness is a natural state there. Happiness is a natural state. So as the teachers say, this is not about freedom for you, it's about freedom from you. Freedom from the idea that you are a separate self, that you're a personality, and the suffering that goes along with that. Freedom from that. You know, last Wednesday when my teacher was giving a talk, he said something that was very interesting. He said that we say in these teachings that there is no self in this body. And in Buddhism, they actually say in the Heart Sutra, there is no self. There is no such thing as a self. There is no self in this body. And so my teacher said, okay, if there's no self in this body, where is the self? That's like a koan, right? Where, if there's no self in the body, where is the self? See, this is interesting because, well, but you see, this is interesting because when you try and answer that question, right, you stay with the assumption that there is a self and you start looking to see where must the self be, right? But you've already made the mistake by believing there is a self and it can be located anywhere, right? No, there is no self, and what there is the awareness, but the awareness doesn't exist anywhere because it has no form. So it's a question that's a setup. It's a question that can't be answered because the question itself doesn't make any sense. And the fact is that because there's no self, you can relax. All the problems of the self don't exist when you start to experience no self. They don't exist. There's no problems when you are experiencing the natural state because there's no self for there to be any problems. All there is what's happening, right? And you used to think what you were as a physical body and a self is separate from what's happening, experiencing what's happening, right? But when you begin to experience the truth and you start to experience that it's not separate from what's happening and there is no separation, there is no self, then you start to experience freedom. It takes study, it takes practice, it takes time to wake up and realize what's actually true. But it's worth it. What could be more important than realizing what's actually true? What could be more important than realizing what you actually are? So you can start to live a real life. Because until that happens, you're not living a real life, you're living a thought life. And that life is going to include suffering, and no matter how hard you try and be happy and peaceful and satisfied, it's never going to work. Because you're trying to be happy, peaceful, and satisfied as something that doesn't exist. How can you be happy, peaceful, and satisfied as something that doesn't exist? Okay. You know, one of the ways that this is talked about is that to discover and experience your actual self is like what Michelangelo said about creating sculpture. He said, you just chip away everything but the image, and that'll be what's left. So if you have a piece of rock and you have you want to make a sculpture of a person, you just chip away everything but that. The same thing is true here, right? This is a process of negation, you know? Chip away everything that's not real and what's left is real. The thought process wants to comment on this. You see that? Yeah, the machine wants to comment on this. Why? Because it starts to smell its end. It starts to detect that there's a threat to its existence, and so it'll say, oh, this is very complicated, very complicated, very difficult, very hard to do. Very few people succeed at this. You know, you should read up about enlightenment and find out how few people are enlightened so you don't waste your time.